Facebook, YouTube. It's your girl, Chrissy. Thank you for joining me for yet another episode of Cipher Knowledge with Chrissy. We have a really great show for you today. But before we introduce our guests for the evening, I'm going to do what we always do, and that is let you know about 2M1L Media over on YouTube. Starting January 2021, all of the 2M1L Media family will be exclusively on YouTube. That's not to say that we won't add the links onto our pages. Our Facebook pages are still going to be there, but as far as watching us live, it's going to be solely and exclusively on YouTube. So we're giving you now 5 weeks notice. So head over to M1L Media on YouTube, subscribe, like, hit the notification bell so you can get all your up-to-date content and know that when we go live, so you don't miss any episodes. So before we go in and introduce our guests, we do have a couple of people coming on to say hello. Hi, Emma. Hey, Angel. Hi, Prunella. Thank you for joining. Hi, Maria. So now that we've got that out of the way, thank you guys. Please stay on for this whole show. You are not going to be disappointed. Like I said, it is going to be a great subject. We are talking mental health and trauma with Joe Sampson. Joe, would you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Hello. How we doing? Ciphered Knowledge. How's everyone doing? My name is Chrissy mentioned. My name is Joe Sampson. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I'm licensed in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and I've been doing this work for about 20 years. So I specialize in working with adolescent males, particularly adolescent males in the marginalized community, people that look like us. So if you don't look like us, please don't get offended. It's not my intention, but it's just, that's a part of what I do. And I guess I can say who I am right now because, that's the work I've been doing. So that's a brief introduction of me. So,
all right. I'm just scrolling through all the everything. So glad. Thank you. It is important, and it is definitely important in our community because there are some things that we are going to discuss, with regards to that. Hello. So listen, this is the one question I ask everybody at the top of the show. And that basically is, what inspired you to become an LPC? What inspired you to get into this line of work?
Oh, well, it's a long story. It's I don't know if we
only an hour show.
Yeah. I don't know if we have time for all of that. Well, I initially wanted to be a magician, to be honest with you. No, I'm messing around. No, I actually initially, when I was a youth coming up, well, if you could tell by my accent, I was born in Guyana, and I came to the States when I was, I think, 11 or 12. My mom, she came over to the States because my brother, when he was maybe I think about 6 or 7, he got burnt really bad, and they just couldn't. They didn't have the facilities over there to take care of him. So she subsequently came to the States with him, and then myself and my siblings, we came after. So I wanted to be an astronaut, actually. So okay. I thought that was the thing to do. I could stay up above and watch over my family, make sure everybody was good. And as I got into high school, I met some real good. I was on the track team in high school, and I met some really cool classmates. As a matter of fact, we still keep in contact today. I was talking to one of them this morning, and there was this one particular cat on the track team. I looked up to him, and he was older, upperclassman, real eclectic personality, and he was 2 years ahead of me. So he graduated, and he went to college, and he would come back, and he would share with us his college experience. And he talked about psychology and psychology courses that he was taking and how fascinating he was by what he was learning. And I said, wow, if this guy is fascinated by something, that's something that I got to look into. So when I graduated and went to college, I took up psychology as a major. And I too was fascinated by psychology, and I found that it came, in a sense, came naturally to me. And after that, I graduated with my bachelor's in psychology, minor in Afro American studies, and then I was looking to go to grad school for I wanted to get a PhD in psychology, and so I went a friend. We're in the university, and once we graduated, you had about 6 months left on your ID to go to the gym. So we're trying to figure out what we're gonna do, and we're at the gym, and my friend he loved basketball, so he was always there for the basketball. And then we ran into another classmate, and he said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" It's like, "You graduated. What are you doing?" And he said, "We're just looking for experience for grad school." And he said, "Hey, I know this great place that you can go and get experience." And so he's like, "Just go and let them know that I recommended you, I referred you." And it was a residential treatment facility for adolescent boys. And we showed up, we interviewed. I got the job, my friend didn't. And I didn't know there was such a place for adolescent youth, or I probably would have just been like, "Hey, I'm going over here." No, but went there, worked, and I met some really awesome colleagues there. And initially, it just was a place that provided experience for grad school, and then gradually, as you got into the minutia of things, I found that again, this was something that came naturally to me, and I recognized the significance of that. And then after just working there, I had some really I guess great influences. There were a lot of people my age and who were in the field who were pursuing their masters and encouraged me to do that. And I subsequently did that, and here we are.
And here we are 20 years later.
Yes.
So I want to bring Laura's comment back up. I actually know Laura personally. She is a psych nurse for children. She's a for adolescents psych nurse.
Hey, Laura.
So she knows this kind of in and out. She works locally, but I won't give away where she works. So thank you for sharing that. And I know Joe on a personal level, and maybe one day I'll talk about that. Maybe one day when maybe one of my guests don't show up, I'll talk about that. But I know Joe personally just for some things, and I am so glad you did go for your PhD, because then I would have never met you under the circumstances I did, and that's just my own kind of selfishness, but it's all right. So I want to ask you if you can define what trauma is, because I feel often like people misappropriate the word trauma or think it's very narrow and kind of pigeonhole it and don't look at how broad trauma really is. So can you define what trauma is for us?
So I'm going to try to give my best explanation. So I took a few notes because I was I was thinking about this and how best to present it to the audience as we converse with each other tonight. So I'm gonna give, I think, such somewhat of a book definition, and then I recently attended a training virtually at Rutgers University, and they in that training, I thought I like the way they articulated trauma, so I'm going to share both. So, in a sense, the book definition is trauma is the exposure to a deeply distressing, or what's the word, disturbing experience, right? So when I hear that, and when I think of that, I think on a, just on the average day, how often we experience, deeply distressing and disturbing experience, particularly during this time of the pandemic, right? So keep that piece in mind. So at the training, the definition and it was they associate themselves with a National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And their definition of trauma, they said trauma is an experience or exposure to an actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. Right. So, I mean, just, when I heard of that, and that spoke volumes in the sense that as individuals, and I know the population that I work with, most often the youth and their families, and when they share their experiences, I think about how often, they have experienced a traumatic event, and you know, and it may be something where they're so accustomed to it that it becomes, like an innocuous act or experience, but it's still a traumatic experience.
Right. It's normal, right? It's something that's just normal. And your mother's mother was affected by it too. And so it's supposed to happen. So it's not trauma. It's just the way life is. Right.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And I think most often when we think of trauma, right? And I know you watch television, you may read a poster and you see an infomercial and they talk about PTSD, right? So I think in general, the average person, when you hear trauma, think about PTSD and not, or don't understand or get the concept of how all encompassing trauma is, right? So, I know one of the things that I looked at when when we talked about this show is just, getting a sense of trauma, right? So you have acute trauma, right, and that's one traumatic experience, right? Then you have chronic trauma, and that's exposure to a repeated and prolonged experience of a traumatic event. And in this training, there was this one person just kept saying complex trauma, complex trauma, complex trauma. And complex trauma is the exposure to multiple traumatic events, right? And it impacts you interpersonally, right? It's invasive, and it's long. You can experience it long term. So
yeah, even Laura says even neglect is trauma as far as kids are concerned.
absolutely, absolutely, right? So and I think that's an excellent point, that neglect is a form of trauma, right? So hunger, is a form of trauma. When we talk about, I again, I focus on people of color, African American, people in the diaspora, and their descendants, but particularly if you're talking about trauma in in the United States, right? And you look at the African American population, you talk about generations of trauma, right? So you're talking from slavery, generations upon generations upon generations. And then you also have trauma that's systemic, poverty,
Yeah.
right? Housing discrimination, right? Because it impacts you in a pervasive, in a personal way, right?
Absolutely.
And I think, again, what some of the way
You
I
don't have
communicate.
to be gentle with your
No,
words.
no,
This is a
no,
free flowing show. This you don't have
no.
to be careful with me.
Nah, I try to so the way I communicate oftentimes it's in a circular pattern, right? So when I like to tell stories, I find that particularly working with the clients that I work with, oftentimes if you can tell a story that relates to their experience, they're more willing to receive the conversation and engage with you on a level that then they're able to let their guards down. And just if we're talking trauma, the act of just being guarded is a reaction to an
Right.
experience of trauma. Right.
We have a question from Dwayne. He says, when it comes to trauma, do you treat the symptoms or do you also treat the root cause of the trauma?
Do I treat the symptom or also the root cause of the trauma? So I try to, when I work with the youth, I try to look to address both, right? So I would approach a client in a supportive manner, so where we would talk about, what are the symptoms and provide coping skills, or just utilizing some CBT approaches to help the client manage, those symptoms, right? So if you have, for example, and when I hear symptoms, I think of a youth who's angry and lashes out at parents and friends and
The ones who care for him the most.
yes, right. So then I would in working with that client, I would, try to reteach certain well, I shouldn't say appropriate, but better approaches to managing those interpersonal relations with those caregivers or teachers in school or whomever, right? But then also on the flip and work to identify the thought processes behind those behaviors that are unwanted behavior.
And I think some of that can stem back, right, to if you think it's normal behavior, right, then you don't know what the root of the problem is.
Yes.
Because you can't acknowledge what the root of the problem is because it's normal behavior.
So right in there, I think you hit a great point, right? So you think it's normal behavior based on the trauma that you've experienced. So now that is allowed the trauma has shaped the way you think and the way you respond to certain behaviors. So for you, that's the normal way of approaching it, or one should respond to a particular situation, right? And then here it is, this weird guy with a weird accent is coming into your home, and or
I never thought you had a weird accent ever, by the way. Never thought that.
And he's telling you, maybe you should try this, or the teacher is telling you, no, that's not okay. But the way your brain is wired, that's the appropriate response, right? You should be guarded because you feel threatened. Even in a situation that you don't feel threatened, but your perception of the situation is that. So it's working to reteach and relearn some of those behaviors so that I never say it's normal, because I think normal is arbitrary, right?
Right. It's subjective.
What's the most appropriate behavior for that situation, right? So that's the I think the best answer I could give Dwayne at this.
I think it was a great answer. We have another question. I told you we have these questions set up, but sometimes the audience the viewers gear some things a little bit different sometimes. But if the root cause is from brain injury, what type of tools are used?
So I cannot speak to brain injury because that's not that's outside of my spectrum or my scope of practice. So I would say speak to a neurologist or someone like that, and see how they would approach that particular.
Yeah, because depending on where the brain injury is, it affects different types of behavior, speech, this, that. So, that's why you would want to see a neurologist for that. But I mean, all of it, I think.
Who asked that question?
That's actually my mama.
Hey,
that's
mama.
My mother.
How you doing? Listen, I'm sorry I couldn't answer that question for you. Don't hold it against me, though.
She won't. She's just trying to find. We can talk about that offline. Just some stuff, But so Because I think I know the answer to this, but I think it's an important question to ask. And what's the population, the demographic that trauma affects the most?
So, wow, that's a stat that I'm going to have to get back to you on that. But what I would say is that trauma is not um, assigned to one particular population, demographic, age range or group. What I would, say where I focus on is in working with youth and adolescent in urban centers, right? Because there's a plethora of trauma there, um, particularly when again when we're talking about youth and families in their inner cities who've had a history, generations of trauma, who's have generations of being marginalized, right? Who've had lack of resources. So those are all incidences or issues of trauma. So what I can speak to is that population. There's an abundance of, I would say, a pervasiveness of just trauma within that population.
Can I say, and this is no expertise, more of experience? And you know my slogan, if all you experience is all you know, then you have a deficit of knowledge. So this is why I'm trying to learn and expand my knowledge base with these shows. But what I'm going to go out on a limb and say is that I believe my population, my African American Latin community, is very much against seeking any kind of help. And I think that's why we find it more pervasive and more generational, because you're weak or you're crazy. And this is just my experience. So
Mm-hmm.
you can tell me, and I'm just talking based on my experience. So
Mm-hmm.
you can tell me I'm right, I'm wrong, I don't know, but this is what I've experienced in my life and what I've seen just from my family alone. Like if you try to go get outside help, you're crazy.
So I would say maybe 15 years ago, I would agree with that.
Okay.
Right. What I've seen now is that, and one of the reasons I say that is because the population who've experienced trauma, right? They've had youth who have been involved in therapy, right? So because of you have, you know, in Jersey was a DCP&P, and you have the different care management officers, and there is an involvement within the system. Uh, Families are more open to the experience of having therapeutic intervention. So I have clients where I have a youth who would call me, and he would call me and say, "Hey, I just got into a fight with my brother," right? He's like, "Well, you're my therapist, so I need to tell you what's going on," and then
Mm-hmm.
progressively, it's like, I want to tell you that I didn't get into a fight with my brother, but you're my therapist, and I want to tell you what's going on. And then in the background, you hear Dad say, "Call your therapist, call your therapist," right? So,
Good. That's good.
yeah, so I think that is definitely shifted. I know,
Good.
again, I was talking about the stories, right? So I can go
Right.
back to, I recall my mom, and she has since passed, but I recall she was in her 70s, and I had asked her a question about um, growing up, right? And I had asked her something that had to do with our family. And, here's my mom, and she just broke down and she started crying. And, in her awesome, loving, authentic Guyanese accent, she said, she used to call me Joey. And she said, "Joey," she said, "I had a hard life," and she said, "I didn't have a home to sleep in. I had to walk miles to go get food. I had to do, barefoot and all of these, excuse me, these things. And here I am, and I'm looking at my mom, and on one hand, I couldn't conceptualize her experience, and on the other hand, I was just so emotional
Of course.
because
I feel it now. I feel it.
again, that's mommy, and it was just I couldn't imagine that because when I come up, my grandmother, she raised us, and I mean she took, I probably saw my dad once, you know what I mean, but I didn't miss that experience because my grandmother, she made sure that all of that was there. And it was difficult for me to understand how my grandmother could take care of us but not my mother.
Yeah.
But
It's
going back
different.
to
Go ahead. I was just gonna say, as a grandmother myself, you learn a lot more. You become wiser when you're a grandmother than when you're a mother. Because as a mother, you're just learning. And by the time you've learned, your kids are grown and now have kids, and now you know what to do for their kids.
Absolutely. So that's a
I
valid
do I do just want to get to this because I feel like you need to hear this.
point.
From Prunella Harris. She says, yes, Chrissy, you're so right. It's great that you have a Black male therapist on your show. Representation is important. We still have a long way to go, but this is such a great start. So I
Prunella,
wanted you.
shout out to Prunella. Prunella, how you doing? Appreciate the comment. No, but I just wanted to say, so to my mom, a perfect example, experienced trauma, never spoke about it to a professional, right? Was able to muster up some of that in our conversation. Um, Fast forward, right? So my sister, um, she's experienced this whole COVID. She works in a nursing home. Again, we grew up in a culture where talking to a professional was not the norm, right? And I was talking to her some months back, and she said, Joe, I've seen so much death that when this thing is all over, I'm going to need some real professional help just to work through all of this. And I say that to say is that one, there's a shift in the culture, right, of therapy, but also we have to pay close attention to what this pandemic, what it means to us and what it's doing to us in terms of how we experience trauma, and what are going to be the ramifications of that as
Yes.
this winds down.
Yeah. So again, like I said, we've got 2 questions in queue for you. I don't know if we're going to get back to our questions, but that's okay because this is what we want. We want the viewers who are watching to ask their questions. So
That's not okay. I had a script.
I told you, don't write a script. It says, how would you teach a 13-year-old to overcome guilt from having to choose which parent to live with? I know each child is different, but are there basic tools?
So what I consider that is, I would recommend the 13-year-old, if he's experiencing or she is experiencing that, I would recommend that they see a professional, a mental health professional. And, each mental health professional has a particular modality of treatment that they would utilize to work with that individual. But I'd say first and foremost, I would just recommend that you do that and have that conversation
As soon as you can, too, because that child's gonna need a non-biased individual that they can speak to honestly and openly and get all their feelings out. Because if you try to talk to them as a family member or anything like that, they're gonna still feel like you're taking sides. And I'm speaking on this like a little bit personal kind of level, understanding what the question really, where it stems from. But we have another question. Can you speak about the trauma from the lack of a positive Black father or male role model?
All right, repeat that question.
Okay.
Repeat that question on it.
Sure. Can you speak about the trauma? So I guess what does the trauma look like? How does it present itself from the lack of having a positive Black father or male role model?
Okay. I think So
that was kind of my next question too,
yeah,
right?
so I'm not sure about having the trauma of having a male role model. But what I would say is that
Not having one.
yeah, I would say falls along the lines of neglect and abandonment, right? And what that means and how that impacts that individual person. So you may have because that child has experienced that trauma, they may respond in several ways. Um, they may have incidences of anger or incidences of frustration. They may it could lead to substance abuse, um,
Anxiety,
inability to regulate, and it falls along the gamut, right?
yeah.
So because we know that trauma and the sciences that the trauma has, their effects to trauma. One of the things what I would say or would recommend is always be supportive to youth or anyone who's experienced any form of trauma. I think by being supportive, you're able to get a sense of what the needs are, and youth are able to feel a sense of comfort, particularly if we're talking about someone who has been abandoned. Um, and this a thought just came into my head. I had taken a jot down a little note. Let me see if I have it here, which I think for me kind of touch or hits that topic right there. Where it says trauma. Um, it helps us. It helps us understand the behavior, right? It doesn't explain the behavior. It's not an excuse for the behavior, but it helps us understand the behavior. So I think if you are able to recognize that there are some issues or difficulties that you are experiencing with a child, and you associate that to the lack of having a parental figure or some a level of abandonment, then that tells me that you are paying attention and you're supportive to that particular youth. I would say the other piece is, and I always go back to speak with a mental health professional. Do an assessment, have them do an assessment, and see exactly, can do their best to pinpoint what's going on with the particular youth, and help you work through those issues. And there are a lot of great mental health professionals out there, and who do a really wonderful job of helping families, on a day-to-day basis. So I would definitely encourage
Absolutely.
that you do that.
So, and I'll go a little personal in this because you guys get to know me a little bit more and more each episode. My youngest, who is going to be 14, when his father and I divorced, there was still some relationship there, but when he hit about 10, I want to say 10, when he hit about 9, 10 years old, his father decided to give me sole full custody and walk away and not have anything to do with him. Hasn't seen him, hasn't spoken to him, nothing. And my son suffers from high anxiety. He gets very stressed out very easily. The other thing he does is, and he's been seeing professional, I've been having him have professional help for the last 4 years. He does this self-doubt and that negative self-talk. Why can't I do anything right? I'm always getting it wrong. I'm so stupid. Why, so it can manifest either ways. It can manifest where they internalize it and blame themselves for everything that's gone wrong, or they can explode it outwards and take that anger, and instead of internalizing it to themselves, project it onto other people. And I've had a little bit of both, but like I said, that'll be a whole nother subject, a whole nother show. But like Joe said, if you're recognizing that there's some kind of trauma, lasting trauma, that's coming from the abandonment issue, then seeking help is going to be the first thing. And let me tell you, just by experience, and Joe, you can tell me I'm wrong again, because this is just my experience, but you may not always get it right the first time with the first person you go seek help from. You may have to go through a several set of therapists, counselors to get the right match for your child, because it's not always going to be a home run the first time you get someone. So with that said, don't just dismiss it because it didn't work with the first one. Keep trying until you find the right one. I just
No,
wanted to.
absolutely, I agree. And I would say that when you are when you are it, when you are looking for, let's say you're looking for a car, right? If you go to buy a car, do you pick the first car that you see? Um, you want to factor in price, you want to factor in if it's something you like, you take it for a test drive and all of that. And that's a car, right? This is your child. This is you if you are looking for therapy. So I would say when you do that, you want to do an interview, right? You're looking for someone to be of benefit to you as you look to heal and get help in this process. So I would say you would want to scrutinize that process even more. So as you do your as you look for help, do your research and find out if that professional works best for you. And Chrissy is, I would say, 100% on that. If it doesn't work the first time, I would don't give up. Find that match. When I work with youth, one of the things I ask them is, when you started walking, did you just automatically get up and started walking and then just started running, or did you crawl and fall and hit your bottom a few times and grabbed onto a chair and then eventually you started walking, and even now you may slip a few times, but you get up and you keep going at it. So I would say when you're looking at your mental health and your overall well-being, you definitely want to explore what is out there and what is the best fit for you. The other piece I would say is self-care. Self-care is so important. So you want to make sure that you are taking time to give yourself, some pampering and making sure that, you are at your best. Going back to, when you're on a flight, what they say is that, if we're going down, these oxygen masks come down, you want to make sure you put yours on first before you put it on the next person. Because if you go to put it on them, you may pass out and then both of you are in a pickle. So self-care is
That
very.
is so true, but that is so hard. It's so hard when you're dealing with the trauma of your child, and now you have to be that adult that's recognizing and not letting the generational trauma affect and seep into their lives. It's hard to take that step back, and it's hard. You have to do it. I'm not saying don't do it, but being that it's hard, you still have to do it. So definitely make sure. Dwayne says, to treat trauma, are you for medication management or therapy?
Personally, I am for and this is personal. So in my personal life, I've experienced both that in a combination of medication and therapy, talk therapy. I found that to be extremely effective. So that's personally. For you, I would say you have to do your research and find out what works best for you.
Yeah.
And talk to a professional and get the most information that you can get, that where you are comfortable to make that decision.
And there's a bunch of different therapy out there. My son, I had him, not the 13-year-old, my middle one, my 20-year-old. I had him in CBT, which is the cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mhm.
As he got older, that's what I had him in. It worked well for a while. But at a certain point with him, I recognized, even being a nurse, I recognized with my son that I had to go a little bit further than therapy for him. um I for years I kind of held back and was like, no, 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 no. I'm against medication. And then there was just a certain point where you say to yourself, I've done everything, I've tried everything, I think I need to try this. And when I finally did try that, it was a big change for me. The only thing that ended up happening for me is that he aged out and he became 18, and I no longer had control over what he can and can't take. And he decided on his own that he didn't. need to take it. So that's a whole nother episode, Joe, that maybe we could come back and talk about, because, also the effects of mental health on the families that have to deal with the individual that is affected by it, but chooses not to seek the help for it. So that's a whole hour in itself right there. But I think we kind of touched the how does it manifest. But I think one of that we didn't touch was what's the impact of childhood trauma, I guess, with then becoming an adult?
So if childhood trauma is left untreated, you have so I let me back. I think we are amazing people, right? Or organisms. So we're able to adapt and make great strides. That being said, for some people who are unable to have the supports needed to reconcile with some of these issues of trauma, you have later on in adulthood, you may experience inability to have strong, healthy relationships. You have a huge percentage of people who are abusing substances. You have suicide that's related to trauma. You have people who have a loss of a sense of self, right, and are unable to function effectively in society. You have mass incarceration. You have, I was telling you about the circular pattern of my conversation, right?
I love it. Keep going. Yep.
So going back to my story, right? I was talking to a gentleman about, he was telling me, he's like, it's actually my neighbor. He's from New York, and he's a New Yorker, and he had moved to Connecticut. I'm not gonna.
Now you got an accent.
Yeah, New York. New York. I don't want no problems. I'm just saying he's a New York. All right. So New York City life, aggressive. Again, the nature of the city, and he says, he said, I don't see an issue with where people are saying that there's discrimination and all that. My belief is that if you work hard, you can be successful, and that's just it. So we got into a robust conversation about that. And he had made mention that, he said, for instance, I was looking at this video and this person got pulled over by the cops. And he was saying, like, the way they responded to the police officer, escalated the situation. And if that was me, I got pulled over, I would have acted a certain way. And I guarantee that the situation would have been, what it is. It would have been a smooth transition. And I thought about that. And when I was, thinking of trauma, if you have, years and years and years of traumatic experiences, right? You're not intentionally, you get pulled over by cops. You're conditioned to because of the trauma, it impacts you to respond a particular way. Right. And that may feel, based on the experience that you've lived, may say that that's the appropriate way to conduct yourself. Right. Again, I'm not condoning the behavior. What I'm saying, it's an explanation, or it gives you insight into the behavior. It comes, from trauma.
So we don't know how many times before this gentleman was pulled over and had poor experiences with the police. We don't understand, if you're not brown and walking in America, you can't understand it. And that goes back to my slogan. If all you've experienced is all you know, you're in a deficit of knowledge. I will never know what it is to be a man, period, but I can sure tell you what it is to be a woman, right? So to try to put yourself in someone else's shoes is basically the epitome of empathy. And I think when we start taking ourselves outside of, I would have, but that would have been your experience and that's not their experience. We don't know what their past trauma is. And maybe if they weren't directly affected by anything like any poor experience with police officers, the fact that you turn on the television and you see this going on, that's still traumatic.
Yes,
it's indirect.
Vicarious trauma, right? So my son, whom I love to life, is amazing 8-year-old, and he fancies himself to be an actor. So he was auditioning for a commercial, and it had to do with the role was a young child whose father was shot by the police after they were pulled over in the vehicle, and he was being spoken to by the detectives, and he was now retelling the story. Um, and here is, my son and I, we watch the news. We've gone to some protests, things like that, and it was so impactful to him just by doing that scene. He was in tears, he was shaking, and he was traumatized by that experience, right? And I recall coming home from work, and he runs and gives me the biggest hug, and tears in his eyes, like, "Daddy, you're here." And even to this day, and this was maybe a few months ago, he's like, every time he sees me, he's like, "Kid, Dad, I love you." But you know just going through that, and asking the questions when you see these protests on television. "Dad, why?" "Here you go." And sometimes I walk in the house and go, "Dad, here, police just shot another black man, and why is this happening?" and all of that. So it's all around us, right? You may not
Right.
experience this, but you see it on the television. You read about it in the newspaper. There's a blog about it. It's just so all encompassing that it impacts us, and we have to be cognizant of that fact.
Absolutely. Directly or indirectly. And we so many times just brush it off, but it actually affects us more than we think it does. Dwayne says, "How would you treat someone going through domestic violence or abuse and they don't want to leave the relationship?" That's not fair, Dwayne. You wrote the book on the ripple effect. You are you were on a domestic violence task force. So he's prodding you.
No,
That's
no,
what he's doing.
Dwayne, that's quite all right, Dwayne. I appreciate that. Dwayne, the first step I would do with Dwayne is, again, I always come from a place of support. And I think that's the best way to start, to engage someone, and then you can go into the minutia of that. But I think, I would say, Dwayne, if you and I were to be walking down the street. Are you from New York, Dwayne?
Nah, he's from the NC, North Carolina.
Okay, so maybe North Carolina is not, New York again. I just like. But Dwayne, if we're walking down the street, right, and I see you, and I smile and I give you, maybe a fist, or shake your hand, um, you know, or if I walk down the street and, you know, I don't think I'm too old, or you too old. Ice grill you, right?
Yeah, about.
That's still part of vernacular, right? And I ice grill you, and I walk down. For
He
those,
says I'm speaking from a clinical aspect.
yeah, for those who don't know about ice cream, it's a stare. But if I stare, you're more inclined, I believe, to receive me by a handshake and a smile, right? As compared to a stare, and where it's in a threatening manner. So if I, in approaching that, I would start off with being supportive, and then we would, proceed with our therapy sessions.
Okay, yeah, and then definitely, I guess where the question's coming from, if you've got someone in there now, Dwayne, you and I both know if we've got someone in a counseling session for abuse, they're already at the point of getting ready to leave. So that's not going to be that hard of a transition, or right? Because if you're acknowledging that you're in an abusive situation and you're seeking help from it, you really think their mindset, Joe, tell me if I'm wrong. Do you really think their mindset is that they're planning to stay much
So,
longer?
so I don't want to speak hypothetically, but I would say, if you are in a counseling session, people go to counseling for all sorts of reasons. It may be in a counseling session on how they can reconcile that relationship, even though the relationship is an abusive one,
Okay.
right? What
Touche.
what are what
See?
are they looking for? It may be that they're looking to transition, and looking to find a way to come to conclusion and bring that relationship, to an end. And they're looking for a way to rationalize that. So I can't speculate on hypothetical. I would go back to say, that's how
How
I
you would
would
approach it.
approach that particular client, would start with coming from a place of support.
So we got, do you believe that a person who builds walls around childhood trauma can live with self-therapy?
What I can say is that we're resilient, resilient individuals, right? So that may last for a while. It may last a lifetime. It may not. It depends, I would say, on that individual and how strong-willed they are. Um, I'm a licensed professional counselor, so I'm gonna say you should seek therapy, right? I believe that therapy can be extremely helpful. So, but
Yeah.
they've before before I did therapy and before I guess my supervisors did therapy, the human race, I think, continue to evolve, right? And people continue to live with their trauma and have babies, and the population grew and all of that, right? So what I'm gonna say is that there are examples of that, right? And I'm sure people have experienced trauma way before that, and they've
Right.
been able to survive and thrive. So I think that can answer. But what I would say is that if we're looking at point A to point B to C, if you look at how intergenerationally how that family has been able to cope with that trauma, perhaps there could have been an intervention somewhere there with that may have been of support or benefit to that family or that particular individual.
Right. And it may not have lasted as long or gone that deep into the generations because it would have ceased at a certain point. I always say abnormal is normal. There is no such thing as normal. So, so I think that's kind of, I think everybody, like, and somebody else said it here. I think everybody, I think your wife, right? Said it that everybody at some point has suffered trauma at some point or another in their life. And that's true. I mean, how you handle it is going to be, and how you recognize, I think recognizing it first is the most important thing, right? Recognizing it first, because you can't change anything you don't recognize. And then working it into that, what you're going to, now that you've recognized it, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
Right. And with that, we segue into what treatment is available to help people facilitate coping skills. Like what's out there.
So
Yeah.
there's it's a variety of treatments out there, right? So what I would say again, look for a mental health professional. They'll do an assessment of you, and based on the results of that assessment, they can provide treatment. You have CBT treatment. There's exposure therapy treatment. Um,
What is exposure treatment? What's
so
that?
exposure therapy is where you're gradually they will introduce a stimulus or gradually introduce a traumatic event. So you've experienced trauma, um, and you're responding a particular way. And part of the way to alleviate that trauma is to gradually expose you to that fear, so that you realize, so that in some point there's a realization that the fear, you can overcome that fear by gradually exposing, and your fears or that trauma, your fears about that trauma is not as pervasive as you may imagine it.
So would that be just because I'm trying to put this on, would that be like somebody who has an phobia of leaving the home? And then you like
Yes.
work on that slowly to have them where they can leave.
Yes.
Like first they go to this front door, then
Hmm.
they're going one step outside the front door, then two steps, and so that would be the exposure therapy. Okay,
Yes, that's
awesome. Sorry, go ahead. So therapy, CBT, exposure therapy.
yeah. So and again, there's a list, but it starts with the assessment and starts with seeing a mental health professional. But there are tons of um, treatments out there and supports out there to help an individual work through his or her trauma and get to a place that is healthy for them to function in their society and do things and respond to stimulus in a different way. Um, Go ahead.
So I have some questions that we didn't put down just because it came to me through conversation. So don't look at your paper. This, what if you go to seek help and you get an assessment and you don't agree with the assessment? Is it okay to go seek a second recommendation, like a second assessment?
Absolutely. I wouldn't, I would go back to saying, as a statement about looking for a car, all right? If you don't agree with it and it doesn't work for you, take a second go round. But what I would say is if you keep coming up with the same results, then you have a decision to make.
Okay. And I just think it's important because, a lot of us think that that's like common sense. You should just know that. But we'll be surprised how much information isn't disseminated to people out there, and they don't know, and they think they're supposed to go in, and that's what they said, and that's what it is, and that's it. But you are, and I say this about healthcare all the time, and I tell this to all my elderly patients, which is you are the sole person that's responsible for your health. So if a doctor is telling you to do something and you're kind of questioning it, it's okay to go see a second doctor. You are, you just because the doctor says it's so doesn't always mean it's so.
Shout out. Can I just give a shout out to my wife? Because
absolutely.
That do describe her to a T. So she'll I recall my daughter, she had an issue with her knee, and she was in a lot of pain. So we took her to the urgent care, and they did what they did and came up with their diagnosis or what have you. And I'm like, okay, problem solved. And she goes, no, what do you mean problem solved? I'm taking her to the specialist. She's like, babe, those people don't know what they're talking about. Like, they're not a specialist. So needless to say, we go to the specialist, and the specialist says, yeah, they don't know what they're talking about. You know what I mean? I'm a specialist. Here's the situation. I see this quite often. They don't, they're just, and again, I'm not knocking them because they're professionals.
Right.
But like, you wouldn't go to
you wouldn't go to an oncologist for a delivery of a baby.
Correct.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm on cars, so I go to a mechanic to deliver a baby.
Yeah, it's just not gonna happen. Yeah. There's a specialty in everything.
Yeah.
So we're not gonna go to the next question because I think we touched it. Is there a stigma around receiving help? And we touched on that earlier in the show. But if you can really quickly, because we're kind of reaching that hour mark, and this again wasn't one of the questions, but here we are. Here I am doing the thing I do. Can you explain to the viewers the difference between a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a therapist?
Okay, so let me start with I'll talk with a therapist. A therapist is primarily, you'll see a master's level clinician who's licensed by a state to work, who has I would say a master's in counseling, or a social worker to work and provide therapy. A psychiatrist is a medically trained doctor who has gone to medical school and has license to prescribe medication, and also can provide therapy. But they're an MD, right? They've gone the full gamut. And a psychologist, typically a PhD, where they have not gone to medical school, but they've gotten their doctorate in psychology or counseling or what have you, and can provide therapy. So the psychiatrist would be the top of the food chain. And typically, if you're working in a facility of some sort, the facility is the psychiatrist license is used to facilitate or provide the venue for medications and things like that, because they have the credentialing and the experience and knowledge to make those assessments on those psychotropics and all of that, and they're able to provide then that supervision around those medications. You'll have your psychiatrist; they'll do a lot of assessments, psychosocial, psychological assessments, things like that. And then, of course, you have your therapist who also do assessments, but not as in depth, and they're not as trained, as specialized as the psychologist to do those assessments.
So I often find, just from my experience, again, this is my experience, someone will see a psychiatrist and a therapist. So their therapist is the person they're going to go talk to for that hour and 45 minutes every week or twice a month or whatever their schedule is. And that psychiatrist is the one they're going to once a month for 15 minutes to get their medications. At least that's been my experience.
Okay. Some psychiatrists also provide therapy.
Okay.
But primarily, I've experienced that as well, where the clients, they'll go to the psychiatrist, they'll talk about the
What's been going
medication, they'll
on? Yeah.
prescribe the medication, get a brief you know
Any changes, any
observation,
side
yeah,
effects? Yep.
and they'll send them. So psychiatrists like a top guy, and their time is valuable,
Yes.
right?
They cost more. That's the more
Yeah,
co-payment.
yeah,
Co-payment.
and they deserve it because they've gone to they've put in the work, they've gone to school, and they're at the top of the food chain. So
I've actually seen some nurses that are psychiatrists
mhm.
that they've gone back to get their doctorate.
Mhm.
So I've
Are
been
you
thinking about it.
are you
I've been thinking about
foreshadowing? You're
it.
foreshadowing your
No,
future to say
no, I no
that.
more school for me. I'm done.
Um,
I am done. But the last thing before we go, I ask our guests if they can give a piece of information, a piece of lasting advice they want to leave with our viewers. If there's one thing that you could part with the viewers, what is that one thing you would tell
oh my, I have a ton. I don't know.
them?
So I've so one thing I could part with is just and I said this before, self-care. Self-care is very important, and particularly, I'm gonna give a shout out to all of the moms, strong moms, and I see my wife. She's pandemic. She's working. She's teacher. It's a lot, right? It's she takes on a huge role, and it can be overwhelming. And at times it is overwhelming, and that self care to take that time to step away from it and make sure that you are at your best, particularly in this time, is important. It's important all the time, but particularly in this time, it's important. Um, so I think that's my if I can see anything, I would say that make sure that you are taking care of yourself, making sure that you are talking to each whomever you have, your friends, colleagues,
Yeah,
whomever,
outlet.
get the support that you need because I just let me just backtrack real quick. Part of my when I started college, I went to a Jesuit university for 2 years, and we had to learn theology and anthropology. We had to take classes in that, and one of the things that stuck out with me, it's from those courses, it talks about um human beings being interpersonal beings, right? And it talked about the importance of human connection. And we are not constructed or built, made to be alone. So we're communal beings. If you working with a lot of the individuals I work with, they've been in detention or on their way. And if you talk to people who have spent time in prison, spent time in solitary confinement, they can tell you how traumatic that experience has been, right? Just being alone, 23 hours a day, locked away. Um, you go crazy in a space like that. So it's important to talk and experience each other, whether it's whatever platform, Zoom, WhatsApp, whatever the case is. Just but make sure
I
that
had a Zoom wine party.
make sure there you go, there you go. Make sure you're keeping in contact with each other.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, just to cut into that a little bit, when COVID first hit out, well, first really started becoming a problem in March, top of this year, me being a hospice nurse, I walked into the facility and each of these geriatric patients were isolated in their own rooms. And I get the reason why. But the first thing I said to myself is, they're all going to die.
Mm,
They're all going to get sick and they're all going to die. And not from COVID, but from isolation,
sure.
from being apart and not having human contact with their loved ones, not being able to interact with the other residents within the nursing homes or the assisted living facilities. And I thought, this is going to be so sad. Because I just knew that, and it does. It brings depression. It brings, just, so many different things. And if you think that mentally it can affect you physically, it can manifest in so many physical things. Hives, burning sensations, cardiac issues, just, but like I said, that could be a whole nother show. And I will have to have you back because there's so much that we could talk about. This topic is so broad. And I mean, we didn't even go how far it can go into addiction and with alcohol abuse and drug abuse, or sex addiction. Like, I mean, it can manifest in so many ways. But I did want everyone to get at least a touch and a dose of what it looks like, how it manifests, and how we can receive help for that. I want to thank you so much, Joe, for being on the show and providing your insight and knowledge and, just giving us your time freely. It really, really is so important to me. And I thank you for that.
Oh, no problem. My pleasure. And Dwayne, I'm coming for you.
You heard that? You heard that? I might have to give him one of your cigars. He was my cigar winner from last week.
Outstanding. Outstanding.
So on that note, guys, I want to remind you to head over to YouTube, 2M1L Media, subscribe, like, share, hit the notification bell so that you can get all our content, get notified when we're going live. As of January 2020, season 2 of Ciphered Knowledge will only be on YouTube. I will share the links on the Facebook page, but I will not be going live. So please make sure you go share, subscribe, like, all of that so you don't miss any of that content. I will leave you with what I say at the end of every show, my slogan. I'm going to go get this trademarked. If all you experience is all you know, then you are in a deficit of knowledge. And that's something that I said quite a few times this evening. And all it really means is that we've got to expand our minds, be a little more compassionate, empathetic, and tolerant. So before we go, we got to thank you so much, Joe, from Laura.
Laura, you're welcome.
Jackie says, great information. Thanks to the both of you. Dwayne says, is season 1 on demand? It's always on demand. As a matter of fact, you can go over to my website, www.cipheredknowledge.com. Again, that's www.cipheredknowledge.com. And all the shows are there. You just click on it, click on the little picture there, and you take you right to that episode. So guys, again, thank you for joining us for another episode of Ciphered Knowledge. Thank you again, Joe. And on that note, one love.